Have you ever thought about sharing your story, but you didn't know where to begin? But what if your story could help others? Who do you speak to about it? Today, I have with me Jenny Barnett, who will share some of her real life experiences, as well as the journey she has gone on in defining, developing, and executing her life legacy. My name is Angelina Carlton. I am the founder of Legacy Planning, a boutique advisory and coaching firm based in Beverly Hills, California. And I have the pleasure of introducing Mrs. Jenny Barnett this morning. Welcome.
Hi, Angelina. Thank you so much for having me today. It's such an honor to be here with you talking about legacy and memoir and some of my experiences.
Wonderful. So to begin, let's break the ice a little bit. And would you share a bit about your background and the book that you recently published and so forth?
Okay, perfect. So actually, I'm still on the journey of completing the book. I'm about to hand my first draft of my manuscript to my editor. So it's an exciting time, and we're actually going to meet on June 14th to discuss everything. So I'm really excited about that, and thank you for having me here to go through that. Now, I grew up in upstate New York and in poverty for my childhood for many years. And so with that, there were certain repercussions. Now, I was very fortunate and I ended up going off to college. And I currently have also a master's degree. So those were some incredible achievements, but there was a lot of, difficult trauma and things that I had to overcome along the way. And so actually, I'm going to be publishing more than one memoir, at least three that I have planned because various parts of the story, it's difficult to get it all into one book.
Yes.
So I want to devote time and attention to different pieces of my
Okay.
story.
So
Yeah.
let's jump into the deep end at the very beginning of our conversation. So before today, one of the things that I had said to you is poverty can be one of the greatest forms of violence. And given what many Americans, as well as other citizens around the world, have experienced in the past year and so forth, would you speak into what it was like for you growing up so that others can understand that you just didn't wake up one day and a master's degree landed on your desk and you just had the skill set to be able to speak about, the real life experiences that you've had to live through?
Yeah, so this is probably going to be maybe one of my more long-winded answers. So be patient with me because I want to draw in others as well into this after talking about my own experience. I think that's important to always, relate back to everyone. And so what yes, that's so true that poverty causes both physical and psychological damage. I was a first generation college student. Neither of my parents graduated from high school.
Okay.
My father only finished through seventh grade, and he enlisted in the Marines in the military when he was only 16 years old, which you could do back then. A lot of people get really surprised by that. You could do that back then in the 1950s, and he was poor. So this is multi-generational poverty.
Okay. Which is a
So
very, I'm sorry to interrupt you, which is a very hard cycle to break out of once somebody
yeah,
is in.
yes,
So
but
kudos to you.
thank you. He was determined, he knew per sort of the American dream, he was determined that I would go to college.
Okay.
He did push for that very, very hard. But the thing is that, and this is part of the reason that for a while I actually didn't want to tell my story because I'm not writing a rags to riches story. I'm writing more of a rags to reality story, which is one that I think so many people are living, but it's not one that we always hear. So there's a lot of triumph in it, but there's also challenges,
Yes.
right? So,
And do you think it's hard to share that story because of the what I might call the cloud of shame that comes around it, or what comes up for you?
I don't, yes, I'm not sure that I exactly feel ashamed because I am proud of my achievements, but I would say that this idea that we have to do things the way other people are doing them. So what's defined as success and what's defined as failure, I'm talking about the predefined ideas in society,
Yes.
that affects us. So that makes us feel a certain way, like, oh, I didn't go here and then go to Harvard. And then I didn't attend Harvard, by the way, but I'm just saying, like, I did go to Trinity College for a master's degree. So it's a pretty elite institution.
But
And
it's what are you so are I'm sorry to interrupt you. So are you speaking into like whether someone is worthy enough to tell their story or the perceptions around how people define success and failure and
yes, it's about the perception. So it's about how other people define it. And then me overcoming that and realizing that no, there's so much value in a story where it's not done in the typical kind of way, right?
okay,
It's not a Hollywood story. It doesn't have to have an ending where it has a neat bow tied up and everyone has a happy ending, and so then you came from here and then you went up here. And I'm not saying, of course, every story has challenges, but
okay,
the sort of coming from here and going on the stair stepper in this really logical way, it doesn't have to be that way, or all of a sudden, right, it seems a certain way. And I think we've talked about it, and I've thought a lot about the fact that there's this violence and poverty, right? Because not only do you have, I'm sure people can imagine it, like you have psychological manifestations that comes from that's lifelong, but you also have physical ones, and people may forget about that because, like, I didn't have access to healthcare, for instance,
okay,
because we don't have that safety net in our society. And without having that, that's had lifelong physical repercussions as well.
okay.
And those also play into psychological
The
issues as well.
effects.
Yeah,
Yeah, yes.
you have the effects of that. So because people need medical care. And so I sort of want to talk about how unregulated capitalism is actually a form of brutality, because
Okay,
I think that many people, right, the system, so I'm not anti-capitalist. I would say that I'm pro-capitalist, but I do think that we need regulations, and I do think that we need safety nets. And it's not just to be altruistic. I'm altruistic, but even if someone is not, I think
okay,
we have to realize how it benefits all of society to have our members of society taken care of, right? So
sure.
if you have someone like me who can be very, very productive in society, but then you have all these factors that hold them back, right? And prevent them from then actually attaining, being where they're supposed to be,
Okay,
right? Then that's really kind of not benefiting anyone. It's not that just that it's not benefiting me, but that's sort of a drain, right? Because imagine what might have been or what could have been contributed. So in my struggles, right, and in the things that I'm going to be honest with you and tell you that I don't achieve all the dreams that I imagine that I would achieve when I'm young. Of
okay,
course, I still have a lot of life left, but
okay.
up to this point, I did not achieve what I thought I would when I was maybe a teenager, in any
Sure,
way, shape, or form.
sure. So if I could again put you on the spot for a moment, what was it like to be homeless? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because how easy is it for anybody to walk by, especially today, somebody and say, oh, look, that person is fill in the blank. That person is homeless. And I wondered if you could speak into it, especially if you were under 18, a child.
Yes. Yeah, I was
Yes.
a young child. I was without shelter 3 different times. It wasn't, so we didn't actually have to live outside. We were able to live in our car. It was
Okay.
not a luxury car. It was an old car, and it was cold and uncomfortable.
Okay.
And I want people to know that we still continue to do the things that people do. I was in school, so I was going to school from my standpoint, and
And
we would go to a rest area to sort of wash up and clean up,
okay.
because father did not want us, he did not want me to have more shame and be embarrassed, by being not kempt. So we would do that, and I would go to school, and he expected me to get straight A's and have good grades. And
So,
maybe that's very unusual, but that is what happened.
so here's your father who had served in the Marine Corps, and he's telling you to get squared away and to clean up. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah. He was really fastidious about that kind of thing. Absolutely.
disciplined.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very disciplined. Yeah.
Okay. So how did it affect you? Because now you're in a place where you can unpack it, and you've also had a couple of guides that have helped you. But how did it affect you? And the reason that I'm asking this is because I think it can be very hard for people to give language to an experience. But sometimes when they hear other people speak about it or speak into it, they can know that they are not alone.
Yeah, and that's obviously the reason why I'm writing the story, to have that impact so that people who've gone through something, it doesn't have to be exactly my journey, but so they know that it doesn't have to be done in a traditional way and that they won't feel alone. And so I think, everyone has to put their own language to it. But I would say that I always felt like an outcast. I always felt like I didn't fit in. And
Okay.
I knew I could observe, of course, like any human, what other people were doing. And I sort of, maybe I built that up more than I should have or could have, but I observed, I sort of knew what went on in their families, and, that they were living in homes, that they were taking family vacations, that they were doing things that we consider quite normal and things that human beings should enjoy, that they were eating 3 meals a day and maybe having a snack after school, little things like that. They had such an impact. And I never felt like I could really share, my life. And that stayed with me. So it's incredible to be sharing my story now, because that sense of, yeah, there is a certain sense of shame and privacy. And my father was a very private person to begin with. So he always really encouraged, like, not sharing what he perceived as weakness,
Which is huge, especially among men. Go ahead.
yes, which I now, of course, perceive as strength, is
Okay.
the vulnerability, right? Sharing that vulnerability and being proud of that and being willing to put that out there, I view as a major strength and an asset. But I understand why, in the time that he lived, and right, being a male and all of these things, being a military man, I understand why he had the views that he had. And it's not always safe with everyone to share our stories and, what we've been through to get to our triumphs. He was not wrong about that necessarily. So,
Right. And I want to get to something he had said to you growing up, that the cruelty that you had experienced initially, he had kind of said to you, just wait till you see what's out there in the world. But before I go there with you, it's interesting because it reminds me of somebody walking outside of like a storefront window, and there are the other people, and you notice they get afternoon snacks.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And I often talk about that. You can see places in the memoir where it's like I'm in this sort of plexiglass box and I can see out, but I can't join anyone.
Yes.
So in the place I grew up is beautiful in the Adirondacks, near Lake George. I
Mm.
actually grew up in Glens Falls, but partly lived in Lake George at times as well. So we would be in Lake George and you would see families, probably a lot of them coming from New York City and so forth, vacationing, and enjoying the beauty, enjoying their time together as a family. And so I would be, working or doing something else. And I never had that opportunity. So it does, you feel like you have regrets before you've even started. You feel this longing to do everything, to be part of everything, there's
Experience
a lot of
everything.
things,
Sure.
yeah, all at once.
Yeah, yeah. Before I go on to the next question, what value do you think you get to honor by being transparent and vulnerable now today as an adult in your 40s?
Yeah, I think it's just helping me to connect with my authentic self,
Okay,
really. Yeah.
okay, okay. All right. And is there anything else that you would want others to know to break through any of the perceptions? Because again, mainstream media doesn't necessarily give a platform,
Yeah,
for
of course. Yeah. Yeah, I would just want people to, first of all, be kind to themselves and understand that they are enough. So I was talking about capitalism. And so, right, it's really about being enough, having enough, accepting enough, right? We don't always have to, even if I'm a person who has made it in terms of financial wealth, that doesn't mean that I am feeling happy or fulfilled, because maybe I keep getting put under this abusive system, which is like there's pressure. Now there's pressure to maintain. So we've talked about that. So people have toxicity in their lives for different reasons,
Right,
right?
right.
So I would say to people, to just know that they're enough, and to, I wouldn't, so I'm not necessarily encouraging people to share their story publicly, right? Because that's not for me to decide.
Okay.
Although I would say, of course, I believe in it. I love the idea of it, but you have to decide. But I would encourage everyone to write their story, not for the purpose of necessarily sharing it, but your story matters. And when you tell even yourself your story, so if
Okay.
you journal it, right, it really makes a big difference in opening doors and how you begin to feel, about yourself and what has happened and all of that. So even if you don't want to share it publicly, or you don't necessarily have to write a book or a memoir, you could end up blogging about it. You could end up sharing bits and pieces of it on social media, or again, you could just keep it private. But I do encourage people to, I teach storytelling
Okay.
to
Sure. Sure.
businesses. So I encourage that, and writing a lot is good.
What would you say was the hardest part of unpacking your story?
I would say that realizing that my story doesn't necessarily fit a mold. And I think that the simplest part is sort of working through, and albeit it's not simple, but when I was experiencing poverty and abuse, and having all of these things happen to me, I think sometimes it can be easier to share times when you're a victim, but it was writing the latter part of my story when I become 18, and not, like I said, not everything was fulfilled in exactly the way. Even though I was making progress, not
Okay.
everything was going exactly the way I thought it would be, or
Okay.
thereafter. And so sharing that part and getting over the shame of that part of my story, that was the most difficult part to unpack.
Okay. And what in particular was hard about it? Because it was unexpected, because it was
Yeah, because it wasn't, again, it wasn't it wasn't traditional. It
okay.
wasn't, or what I had come to know as traditional success based on other public stories.
Okay.
That's why we have to have more people sharing stories, because I think that most people's story is not traditional, right? But it might be the one that gets shared because maybe someone who has a typical rags to riches story. I was homeless, and then I became a Wall Street investor, and then I had millions, and then, and in that there's like some still tragedy where you're like homeless while you're investing, and
Okay.
I'm referencing something famous, but those were the kind of stories that I grew up with as a young person. And when
Okay.
I started to pay attention, I thought, well, gee, I don't have a story like that. So I guess my story is not valid. It's not valid.
Interesting.
Or it's a story about failure. And actually, of course, it's not. And people who know me never think that, but it's interesting how I put that on myself.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. Because of the examples we see. And then, one of the reasons that I'm doing this legacy video series is to offer social proof that is inclusive, so that when somebody gets to define, develop, and execute their legacy, it's not just one route. It's not just one way. It's not just one presentation or format or path. It's going to be unique for each individual.
Yeah, I love
Absolutely.
I love that term social proof, because I think that's something that's also so misunderstood. And that could be exactly it. I didn't think I had the social proof. I didn't think people would. And I love what you're doing, because you're showing people and teaching people and helping them discover their own journey to that, and redefining what social proof really is.
Yes.
So I think that's incredible and so needed, so needed.
So I want to acknowledge that you've done the emotional work. And I
Yes.
think that's why various readers and fans have reached out to you, because
Yes.
we have I don't want to say an abundance of sources when it comes to other areas of our lives that we can define as, like, in it, for instance, if my net worth is X, therefore I am successful. But yet it's like the story you shared when you were watching um, others vacation in upstate New York, and it looked like the grass was greener on the other side. And yet one of the things we've talked about is control.
Yeah.
Just because it looks greener doesn't mean that they, are happy,
So that's
fulfilled.
what I found out, of course, through, what my dad said, that the world is a cruel place, right? He sort of tried to warn me, but that wasn't a message that I was ready to receive as a young girl or even a teenager. That's not a message that many people are ready to receive. But, for all of his mental illness and problems, which I do believe is somewhat connected to the lifelong poverty too that he experienced and the generational poverty that, afflicted his family
Okay.
to a large degree. I do also, believe that he could see things. He had vision, and he understood things. And we can get too simplistic. We can always become too black and white in our thinking, which
Hmm.
is not good. But that's exactly the point. We don't want to make it rich against poor, or
Right.
people who achieve against people who don't, people who win and people who fail, right?
Right.
It's not that kind of a thing. Story arcs, our lives, they're complicated. And so, right, I didn't necessarily see that, but my father, he was sort of teaching me that along the way. I don't know how much it was, obviously sinking into a degree, and then to a degree it wasn't. So
Okay.
that's where I think I'm able to take a step back. And that's one of the things that goes into writing. You have to sort of be able to take a step back from yourself, because you are ultimately relating to your audience. So you're not, when you're writing memoir, you're not changing the story, you're not altering the story like you would in fiction, where you could make it anything you think your audience might really enjoy. You have this story and you have these memories, and so, it's, there's no such thing as the truth, of course. I think most people know this, but it is our experience, and you try to project that as it is in your mind. So you don't really have control over it. But at the same time, you do have a sort of control over the way that you tell the story. And I think, you're going to have to relate and notice these things. Sometimes they're just little details that might seem insignificant, and
Hmm.
really they're very significant.
Do you do you think your father gave you your resilience?
I that's an interesting question. So I actually think that I was born with a certain amount of resilience, which may sound like a fair answer, but I think it's quite possible. Even from a young age, I was able to start right, and this seems like it's not, whatever. And I always had a lot of empathy for others, which is not always common with someone who's experiencing a lot of trauma for
Okay.
themselves.
Okay.
So knowing I have the gifts also makes me want to do more,
And
because
give.
I was blessed with those gifts, right?
Yes.
Of having resilience. But in a way, he did teach me a lot of life skills that you wouldn't normally learn, things outside of college and things outside of school. um, what we used to call some street smarts.
Oh,
But
yeah, that's what I was going to say. The School of Hard Knocks. You had
yeah,
homespun
yeah,
common sense.
what he used to call that kind of thing, street smarts, and yeah, the School of Hard Knocks.
Okay.
And so I think there's another kind of resilience in that. I think there's different kinds of resilience, right? There's this sort of idea that there's a survivor who's
Okay.
resilient because they can overcome things. That's the
Okay.
kind of person my father tried to sort of turn me into, and I am that person. But then there's also, I think, a resilience in being vulnerable and having empathy and all of that as well. And that's something I developed for myself. So there's two prongs to this.
So would you say it's the ability and capacity to be kind in addition to being the prideful brick wall?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I would.
Okay. I realize I'm putting you on the spot and I appreciate your courage to
I
speak
love,
into
no,
this.
I love it. I love it.
Okay, so would you fill in the blank for the following sentence? Here's how I am stronger today for the trauma.
So I think we sort of touched on this
Okay, if you could make it
already.
concise or bite size, you would say,
Yeah, I'm stronger for being a more empathetic person.
okay,
But I want to say that and I have more empathy for myself. So it's not just empathy for others. I think I had that before and I had to actually learn empathy for myself because when we're not kind to ourselves, it's really difficult to continue to be kind to others, which is the result that we want, but we have to come from within with that. So I think that's how I'm stronger. But I just want to say that I don't necessarily think people have to go through something that's very traumatic
or isolating.
to be stronger, right? So we have this idea of associating, like, how can we find the good in it? And I think that that's very human.
Okay,
But I also don't want to romanticize the suffering and say that, like, no, it was a good thing because I'm stronger. So I'm sort of, I'm not against the question, but that's something that I'm sensitive to.
okay.
Yeah.
Could I add a thought to that?
Yeah, of
I
course.
think that
Always.
you have an increased capacity to not judge others because you understand what it is to walk in different shoes, that and those circumstances might be outside of the control of that individual, especially if they're under age 18.
Of course. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We have to take care of children, even if we think that we want to judge their parents for what they're not doing, right? We can never, we can't judge children. We
But
can't.
people are harsh
People are harsh,
and they
right?
can be very harsh
Yeah, no.
because they
So
don't
I
know.
have things to say about that in ways that to, I think, help people think about that so that they don't have to feel like, again, I'm in this camp, you're in that camp, and we will never meet. So I have some
Yes.
thoughts about
And I
that.
think that's one of the reasons why I felt that this conversation was important because it's easy thinking to place people into compartments or categories.
Yeah, so can we let's just talk about that now while we're sort of on it. So if you
Okay.
have people who I've noticed as sort of a common theme in the public sphere and
Okay.
in society is that you would say, well, listen, I didn't come from much, so I'm just telling someone else's story now. I might say, or people have even said this to me, Jenny, you obviously came from nothing and you made this out of your life. Why can't other people just do what you did? I
Okay.
so respect you, Jenny, and I want to know why everyone can't just do that, right? So
Okay.
we this individual level. Or I hear people saying things like, well, I achieved all of this. And so there's this sense in which if I admit that other people need help, that maybe somehow that's taking away from my achievement. And that is not true. I want people to understand in this conversation that two things can be true at the same time. We have a hard time with that as human beings. We think that either this is true, and then if A, then it can never be B.
Right.
And we have a hard time. We think if we acknowledge some privilege that we've had, and there's all kinds of ways that privilege plays out, right?
Hmm.
That it can just be in the form of opportunity that was presented to us, right?
Hmm.
It can be for all kinds of reasons. So I'm not talking about one particular kind because there are
Okay.
so many, but I think people have trouble sort of thinking that, like, I made it all on my own. So they think if they don't hold to that, I made it on my own, I did everything, that I'm so amazing, that will somehow diminish their achievements if they don't stick to that. And so then it's very hard to have empathy for others who didn't do that because that's the story they're telling themselves. And I have to say that I still recognize people's achievements, even when I recognize that they've had some sort of, because we all, even to get where I was, there was some kind of privilege in that, right?
Open
I
doors.
I even had a privilege of open doors, right?
Okay.
For my skin color, for other reasons. And then I had a lot of closed doors as well.
Yes.
So but recognizing that just because, I'm a Caucasian woman, versus something else,
Okay.
that opened some doors for me, doesn't diminish what I achieved. It doesn't
So,
diminish that at all for me. So I just want people to understand that they can realize that some people can't do what they can do, or they might be resilient like I'm resilient, and other people can't tap into that resource. They
okay.
just
So,
don't have that.
so let me see if I can articulate what you said, maybe in one perspective. So, while on the outside you might fit the label of, let's fill in the blank, Caucasian woman, it still doesn't take away from the struggles that you've had to overcome, the journey you've had to go on to, and the things that you've had to face.
Of course.
Yeah. Because
Yeah,
it would be easy, let's say, for someone on the outside to go, oh, she's pretty Barbie. I bet, you know, she has pretty privilege and her life has been easy.
exactly.
And
That
yet I could say to you in some ways, and this is a perception, you can correct me in the moment right now. I think in some ways you had to grow up in what I might call like an adult child, as an adult child, taking responsibilities for things that were beyond maybe age 7 or beyond age 13 in the realities of life that other people didn't take responsibility for. They land on your doorstep, and on the outside, somebody go, oh, pretty privileged. And yet here you are having to evolve your inner landscape.
of course, and they call it, pseudo adulthood, and so that was what I was put into when children are put into adult roles, and that is a major theme of my memoir.
And
Um,
many children out there, keep going.
Many children out there go through that. So, but that's kind of exactly. So while I but it's not just that I want people to recognize about me. I'm only using myself as an example. I
Okay.
just really want them to understand that admitting that other people might need help and resources from society, resources from all of us, is not sort of diminishing what they achieved. Because
Okay.
in order to do that, I understand that they might have to acknowledge that they had some privilege. And that's
Okay.
okay. That's okay though, because with that, everyone has struggles. And that you can admit, but some people have more, right? Some people have more stacked against them. So I'm really on a mission to create that platform and that conversation to bridge that gap, right? From
Of
the people who cannot talk to one another, right?
okay.
And because there's a lot of anger and hurt and trauma in people who have not had access to
Hmm.
things, right? But there's also a lot of anger and trauma and hurt amongst people who have seemingly had access, right?
Yes.
Because they don't know what they've had to do to get there or continue to have to do. And so
Or if they
sometimes
couldn't leave that world
those groups don't want to talk, right?
and they
Because
need to
they
talk.
don't have anything in common, and they need to talk. And I'm hoping to be a kind of bridge and a gateway to groups of people talking, right? Because I've been a little bit on both sides.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Okay. So speaking of tools, fill in the blank for the next sentence if you would. Here's the process that I've been able to utilize to resolve tough experiences. So would you say maybe some of the
yeah,
uh
the process of I would say healthy living and mindfulness.
okay,
And that comes in many forms. For
okay,
me, early on, it came in the form of seeking professional therapy
okay,
um, to get past the trauma. And within that, I learned emotional freedom techniques and, tapping, meditation. Later in life, I came to yoga, and I've had many wonderful guides in, forest bathing and connection with nature and things like that.
okay.
So it's a continual process of growth. And you talked about inner peace, and I'm still on that journey. So I would also want people to know that finding inner peace I think, is a lifelong journey, right?
Absolutely.
Especially because I don't think it's this thing where one day you wake up and you just have inner peace. I mean, there are days when you feel
Like you've
quite,
arrived.
but it's a journey, right? It's a journey. It's a
Right.
journey forever. So
So would you also say that it has been your ability to be proactive with what I might call the part-time job of self-care?
oh, yes, it is quite I like that phrasing because it is quite a job. Um, and
Okay.
I and I'm very proactive about it, and I have to be,
Okay.
because And some of those physical manifestations with my health and repercussions from those childhood experiences and lifelong experiences have sort of forced that on me and thrust that on me, but I've chosen to embrace it. You
Yes.
know, in one sense, I don't have any other choice, because the other choice would be to be very ill and not living out any of my dreams, not being here today. But I choose another path. And so I want to embrace this healthy lifestyle and these things that I have to do. And that's another reason why I promote enoughness, so that
Okay.
people will understand that there is more to life, right, than just this constant pursuit of having
External,
things,
external.
of
Yes.
right, external things, right? Of acquiring and acquiring and acquiring, right? Sometimes we have to stop doing that so we can actually get really healthy and get ourselves healthy. But in order to do that, we have to have a society that, we have to create a society together that allows us to do that. All
And
of us,
encourages it.
and encourages it, where we contribute, and also contribute in the ways that maybe are best for us to contribute, and that
Yes.
gives them fulfillment, and not just it's personal fulfillment, but then also that ends up helping others. So it's the greatest form of legacy to me.
Yes. It reminds me of a quote by Albert Einstein about the fish and the bicycle.
Yes.
Yes, yes. Okay, so before I move on to the next question, again, I just wanted to acknowledge that you are taking responsibility for the part-time job of self-care, because one of the things that I've seen in my lifespan, especially in the past year, is if hard times falls on an individual, they can allow anger to consume them, and then they cannot leave that bubble of anger. And it becomes like, that 6-foot trench that they stay in.
Yeah. You know why
And
I
then the
think
bitterness and resentment get added like onto the ice cream. Yes.
You know
So
what I
yes.
think why I think that happens, and this comes out of my therapy. This comes
Okay.
from my therapist, who would tell me that actually one of the things that happens, because I've done this in the past, where I'm angry, and here's the thing: the anger is legitimate, right?
Okay.
I'm
There's
angry.
justified anger.
There's justified anger in all of us, that something's going on, that some of my needs are not being met, right? Some of my basic needs are not being met, right? There's something wrong. That's the reason for anger. There's something going on. But what I'll do is I'll sort of invalidate my own anger sometimes by saying, like, but I know that it's not a big deal, or I know that other people are suffering too, or I know this and that. And what we really need to do is sort of give ourselves a certain period of time to actually be angry, a confined period. So, say you're going to give yourself a weekend, maybe you're going through a lot, and
Okay.
you're actually going to journal. You can scream it out, not at a particular person. I'm saying, like, privately, you can just be angry without feeling guilty about that. Let
Okay.
that come, and then let it pass, and then move on. And I think that's the key. But we have so much guilt around our feelings that it keeps sort of spiraling, because we're feeling angry, but we're also feeling guilty about feeling angry. And so that
Yes.
actually creates more anger. But then, you just have this vicious spiral.
Yes.
And so that's why I think the anger gets out of control, because I know a lot of people who go through these things. And of course, I get into conversations with others because of my background. And so I really think that that's what causes it.
So here's what I might say about your background. You have the ability to walk through different worlds
Yes.
and understand.
Yes.
Okay. So here's the next question. Boundaries can be a tough area for many because there's not a class in traditional schooling unless one seeks out seminars and retreats to clarify what is one person's stuff versus what others are projecting or scapegoating. What comes up for you with the word boundaries?
Right. You could have an entire program on this, on boundaries. People are constantly exploring this topic. And I think that anyone who's been through trauma has some boundary issues, right? Because usually people have had poor boundaries with them, and then sometimes, right, they're going out and they'll emulate that. So I know for me, sometimes my boundary issues come from an inability to say no to others. I want to help, I want to put goodness in the world, and all of that is valid. But we have to be able to make choices, right? So I would say that boundaries are about practice. You know, you have to sort of practice being able to say no and set a limit, you know, and decide what is right for you. And practice makes it easier. You know,
Sure.
that would be my main thing about that. But boundaries, yes, that's so, so important, because when you get into that, you can get into situations that are codependent, and it affects all of your relationships, you know, even your friendships, of course, your romantic relationships, work relationships. I've seen it go on everywhere. And so many people struggle with boundaries. And it usually does come from, I think, things that have happened in the past.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think practice is a beautiful answer. And I hope that people will consider that just as they might go out to the tennis court, they could go out to the boundary court and yeah,
Uh,
swing the
yeah.
racket for 30 love. Yes,
Love
yes.
it. Wonderful. Yes.
So you have stated to me that sharing your story can lead to one's legacy if that's the right decision for them. What happened and happens for you when you are able to share your story?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I know, because I've talked to other memoir writers as well, that uh, of course, for some people, there's a sense of healing, right? Of
Okay.
letting go of past traumas in your life, um, and having that story. There's something cathartic about making that story public, not hiding behind it any longer. And for me, that occurred at the stage of actually putting my blog and my story in a blog form public.
Okay.
But when
Okay.
I decided to write the memoir and tell the story in a more cohesive way, right, as a book, then I realized I can have this platform, and stories are memorable. We as humans remember stories, and stories open up pathways to conversations, right?
Yes.
So that is something that, you know, can happen. And again, I just encourage people to share their story with themselves. Tell yourself your story, but write it down, even if you're journaling that story. And then whether or not you come to a point of realizing that this story, I want to make it public for various reasons, you know, you have to ask yourself those reasons. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about that too,
Yeah.
on my own YouTube channel, so I can sort of delve into, you
This
know,
answered deeply or more
yeah,
or
and
deeper.
about writing, about sharing your story and writing memoir in general.
Yeah, I think one I want to add to what you've just shared, and I think it's when somebody can share their story, they will be remembered in their legacy more than their work.
Of course, of
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
yeah.
because on the tombstone it could say, Billy or Sally, 19, you know, 82 to, I'm just making up these dates and names, to whatever 2060, and he or she was a carpenter, a banker, a professor. But there's so much more to people in how we remember them, why we remember them, and what went into the human experience. And the last thing we think about necessarily is, oh, they were a great carpenter, plumber.
Engineer or something, right? They're
Right.
an engineer, but
Yeah.
it's how they made an impact, and sometimes, you know, it's in the stories that people also tell about them, right? If you had a great teacher, we've all had a great teacher in school or something like that, and you'll hear, you know, students tell stories, and it's in some of those, it's in the quirky things, it's in the everyday small things, you know. It's not, in order to leave a legacy, if you'll notice, the people who leave the greatest legacies, they just have an impact on people's lives, sometimes in very, what seems like small ways, but it's actually the greatest ways of all, right?
Right.
So they usually don't have on there owned a 8-bedroom house with, you know, with an in-ground pool and things like that in there,
Right.
because that is kind of insignificant, right?
Right.
And
Right. Okay, so many people can get blindsided with what may feel too heavy for them and lose their voice or sense of self in it. In picking up the pieces and reintegrating yourself, what has been the most important lessons, or what have been the most important lessons in building or rebuilding who you are authentically?
Yeah, you asked so many great questions,
I'm putting you on the
right?
spot here.
No, it's completely fine. I think that so many of them have a common theme, right? What we think about as authentic, right? I think everyone has to define that for themselves. And that's what's really important when we talked about showing kindness to yourself. And that's part of your journey to build your authentic self, because we have so much external noise,
Yes.
especially nowadays. We always have, because there's always been expectations. I don't want to say we have more now, but we have different ones.
Okay.
There's social media, there's all these expectations. So it's not just getting lost in your prior trauma, but it's also focusing on what's happening now, right? I think the here and now is so important. And a lot of people can say, well, I've moved past that trauma, but it's just part of your story and it's a thread. I don't think that trauma is something we have to get over. I think it's something that we integrate and we
Okay.
figure out what it is about us that defines us, and what it is that we don't necessarily want to define us, right?
Okay.
Like this feeling, if we have feelings of imposter syndrome because it comes out of some of the shame or other things that we might be feeling, that we don't measure up, it's never enough, there could be so many things, right? So yeah, I think it's so critical that we go on those journeys and question how we find our authentic self.
Can I tell you what I like about your memoir and also who you've become today?
Of course. Thank you.
It's that you've brought all of you,
Thank you. Yeah,
compared to when somebody will disassociate a part of themselves.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Because
Yeah,
what's interesting about that part that they disassociate with could be the part that makes them the most human, the most lovable, the most, yes,
yeah, right.
able
No,
to be magnetic with others. But yeah.
I share that inner voice. I developed, for me, I also, my inner voice, I say this to people, that help to keep me sort of sane and grounded,
Okay.
a nice word to use.
Okay.
I think we all have to find our grounded place. And I practice grounding in yoga, but I think we have to have our sort of mental grounding within ourselves. And that is the authentic self. And for me, yeah, I love those quirky parts about myself. But I did not always, of course, I did not always appreciate those. But
Because
yeah,
of this thought that if I am perfect, I will be loved, or if I am perfect, I will be socially acceptable.
exactly, exactly.
In the subject of multi-generational patterns, which is something we've talked about before today, would you share any wisdom you've discovered that could be in service to another who may be watching or listening?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's like maybe two people that, I could talk to here, which is people who are like myself, who have gone through a kind of trauma, that I would tell them to be kind to themselves, first of all, and understand that they are enough, and also understand that there is help out there, right? And
Support.
even if you have not found the right match and you think that you are alone, there are people out there who are want to help you, are there to help you. There are people rooting for you. I am. And so I want people to know that, and that if your journey has not been traditional, I think that that is wonderful, but I know that it's also painful. I understand that. And so by sharing your story, then that can be one way to, overcome that. And for people who maybe haven't been through something like that, or they think, well, I haven't been through the kind of trauma you're talking about, Jenny, and trauma can look different. So that's the other thing I want people to understand, right? So we've talked about that, and how anyone could be having a difficult time.
Yeah.
I've had people relate to my story who haven't been through, they were going through sort of midlife trauma that was nothing like my trauma, because my trauma focuses mostly on childhood and early adulthood trauma,
Okay.
at least in my, first memoir and everything. But I've had people come to me who are 50 years old and they're sort of feeling alienated for very different reasons with their career, with their friends, with their life right now. And my story resonates with them.
And
And
probably they also feel safe, but also because you've gone on that journey that they can come and say, let me tell you.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
hope in it. There's hope in it. And for other people, I would encourage them to just be open-minded and receptive to other people's stories, really be a little bit open-minded and receptive to that all of our stories don't have to look similar. And so if a story is different than what your common perception of it might be, should be, then maybe there's a lot of value to learn in that.
Yes. And I also have to think that with the multi-generational patterns, like you had said, you saw the poverty that your dad lived through. And then when you thought about your grandparents, that there's different, I mean, obviously it's different decades, different historical contexts, but um, it's finding the place where it's safe, but also finding the people that can be resources, that can be supportive. Because when somebody doesn't have that, then they can, live within their brick walls and their pride comes up, and that's a hard place to be strong every day
Yeah,
alone in that.
for me, I've also, and I should mention this, I've also been a part of communities, and being a part of communities where people also have, past, and they've had struggles, both present and prior, is incredibly giving and empowering. So if you can find a community, success partners, all of that, it's so meaningful. And I know that's sort of, part of what you offer too. So.
So before I move to the next question, did anything surprise you when you learned about your parents and grandparents? Did it allow you to forgive your dad at all, or?
Yeah, I think, yes, that's a really good question. That when we're talking about multi-generational poverty and struggle, it's a lot of struggle. Uh, Growing up, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and it was the era of, big Wall Street, and there were a number of people who were doing very well in the United States. There were a number of people, that's what I witnessed, when you watched shows on television, and we didn't have cable, but sometimes, I was aware there were things going on, but what I could watch, what I could consume, what I saw in school, what I saw in the outside world, you had the perception that a lot of people were doing well. And I think there was a fairly strong, middle class still at that point. There were people also becoming wealthy. There were people capitalizing on a lot of opportunities at that time, but there were also a lot of people who were hurting too. And I didn't realize that for, whatever reason. I knew
Television left that part out.
I feel like around the world. Well, my dad, he did sort of have me watch. It was sort of like the starving children in Africa kind of thing. But as a young person, I was like, but that's not us. Like, I should be doing all the things that all the other American kids are doing, and, having, vacations and doing all these things. So there was that perception. And I would say that, yeah, I blamed him, if he could just get his act together.
Oh,
Right, if he was just a better dad, because all these other people could manage it. So there was a point, and when I blamed him. So, and I think that's the thing about getting out of individualistic thinking, and
okay.
that's so tempting, right? It's so tempting to just blame one person, right? And I'm not
Okay.
saying he's without any sort of responsibility. He has responsibility for his actions. We all do, right? We all
Right.
do. I mean, he has to, as an adult, he had to take responsibility. He had a child, he had me,
You were going to
right?
fix him.
And he wasn't taking the responsibility. But then again, what resources did he have, or what had happened to that point? So I don't have total empathy for him. It's not like, again, it's not the kind of thinking where we either have to make excuses for people or blame them or totally exonerate them. It can be somewhere in between. But
Right.
of course, yes, I did recognize the more that I learned. And then, of course, there is my mother's family, which is, an even more tragic story, which will center my second book will center around more of my mother's story. Because, of course, she is brought into my first memoir, but I have to explore that relationship more deeply. I grew up, I should say that if people are wondering, you talk about my father a lot. I grew up with my father alone. And so it was an unusual situation to grow up with a single father. And
In the 80s.
in the 80s and
Yeah.
90s, I saw my mom only sporadically. And so, but then I have a relationship with her later, more established one.
And your
So
father's now passed away.
yes, both of my
Okay.
parents are.
Okay.
So it's interesting that, and that's when I actually began journaling too. But for sure, to answer your question, I started to view his story differently when I understood. I knew all the things. I knew that he had served his country proudly, which is something that a lot of people respect. They even, they honor it, and we should, because some people sacrifice everything, but everyone who serves sacrifice something. That phrase, I love that saying because that's true. And he did. He sacrificed a lot of self, and he was there at 16 years old because, and coming from poverty, that was an option. There was an
Hmm.
option to go into the military and sort of make something of yourself, get off the streets, if you will, and, to not be sort of a hooligan, this poor hooligan. And so for him, the military was really making something out of his life and growing up. And he also grew up way too quickly, in some ways. And he rebelled against that, and he did not have the resources that he truly needed. And so much of everything was just swept under the carpet, so to speak.
Yes.
Everything just sort of swept away.
And
There was
that's one of the things I wanted to say before I move to the next question, and then we kind of wrap up. It's interesting when you spoke about mainstream media when you're growing up in the 80s and this idea of like Wall Street and big money. Yeah, because it's a slice of what's actually there. It's a slice of reality. And I think that when I think about the word legacy, will it happen from the top down? Will it happen from the bottom up? I don't know. I think that a lot of people are becoming more aware today, but I think that when you are writing your memoirs, you are offering a perspective beyond the easy deliverables of mainstream media regarding what is real and what is out there.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope to do that. Yeah. And I know you're right. We are becoming more aware, but there's still so much work that we have to do because all those perceptions for all those years have sort of become part of our fabric, right?
Sure. And in the subconscious of,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
So what's the positive story you are creating today?
The positive story I'm creating is that survival and thriving and all of these things that are positive can come in so many different forms. So if you are someone who doesn't think that you have done it the right way, or you're confused about the legacy that you're going to leave, I am sort of showing, I think, through my story that there's so many ways that you can do that are, it's not just acceptable, but it's something that we should embrace. And
Yes.
I'm ready to, embrace that with other people.
Good, good. What will help you win the day?
I think what will help me win the day is being a part of a community and, sharing my story with others. So, what we're doing today, having conversations, that to me is winning the day.
Okay. And then do you think that can change perceptions about survivors?
Yeah, because I think, I know that survivor is the more positive word
Okay. What's the negative word?
rather than maybe victim. I know
Okay.
that survivor is
Okay.
sort of been used, but I'm wondering if there's still a kind of victimhood and survivor, built into that subconsciously again, Or we may just think of a survivor as someone, again, who can grit and bear it, who always gets back up on their feet again. And again, I want to show there's some compassion for that, because you can be a survivor. So many people, if you're here today, you're a survivor, right? And you don't have to go through what I did to be considered a survivor. There's so many ways to do that. And so you are a survivor, but that doesn't mean that you're not struggling at this moment. You
Okay.
know, I could have question coming here today because I had a hard week this week. I'm not going to lie. I had a really difficult week this week. Right here, I had a hard week. And
Right.
and so I could say, like, I'm not 100% and I don't need to, I don't know if I can show up today, but you are enough. And surviving doesn't mean always thriving at every single moment. It's a journey. So you're getting there, you're going to get there. That would
Okay.
be my way to change the perception.
Okay, good, good. And if you could ask the viewers or listeners today to any call to action, what would it be?
Call to action would just be to keep an open mind and to keep listening. We learn so much when we listen, and then when we engage in meaningful conversations. And sometimes that involves telling our stories, right? Because that's a very human way that we do that.
And all of the rawness and all of the realness and all the things that we might not want to talk about. And
Yeah,
yeah,
the
yes.
scary parts for sure.
So what would you like your legacy to be in addition to any financial assets?
I think I want my legacy to be that I left the world a kinder place than I found it.
Okay.
So I want to inject this kindness into the world, but I want to do that through sharing knowledge and through sharing stories. So I think kindness, we think of that as a squishy idea, but it doesn't have to be. It can be very knowledge based, and through knowledge, we can develop that sense of empathy and kindness.
Good. Yes. So constructive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because sometimes people can think of kindness as giving somebody a free pass.
Exactly. And
Yes.
that's what I was saying earlier, that we don't need to think of things that way in those kind of hard lines, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for speaking into your life journey and even some of the more touchy parts that I could tell aren't always easy to speak to or into, even now today as an adult. And I just appreciate so much your courage to bring forward your memoir, whether it's the first book, the second book, or the future books to come, as well as how you're serving today as a guide to help others be able to tell their story. And any final thoughts?
I just want to thank you again, Angelina, for making space for me. It's so important for people to make space for these conversations. And I look forward to seeing you helping so many great individuals build their legacy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Okay.
Bye now.